Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, January 19th, 2026, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, if you are interested in supporting the show, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy. You can learn more about how to make a per episode donation. That is what keeps us able to book these episodes, to pay the editors, for me to pay my producer assistant, who also she just does so much important work on the back end, and also carve out that time for each of these interviews. So it's not, we keep it cheap, but it's definitely not free. So I'm really excited that we're able to offset those costs so that we never ever have to charge for an episode or put it behind a paywall. What was I going to say? Oh gosh, yes. I want to give shout outs to the top patrons this week. And one of them, I was so lucky. This past weekend, we did some shows in Seattle with the other podcast I work on, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. And I got to meet one of the patrons there. So I want to give a shout out to Dr. David Compton. A, thank you so much for all of your support over the years. And B, keep fighting that good fight. As a rural physician way up north. I hope it's not too cold now that you're back home. I also want to thank Resolutrial, Chuck Blell, David J.E. Smith, Daniel Lang, Mary Neva, Anu Bhadavaj, Brian Holden, Gabo J., Ulrika Hagman, Pasquale Gelati, and Joe Wilkinson as well. All right, let's get into the episode. So this one's a little bit out of the norm, but I think it still fits in with, I don't even know, what is the mandate? What is Talk Nerdy anymore? It's mostly interviews with people talking about and investigating and writing about things that I think are interesting, usually with a scientific or a social justice bent. You'll hear me say it in the show, but I have to admit that I'm kind of fascinated by cults. And so I was really excited to have the opportunity to chat with Ellen Huet on the show. So Ellen is an investigative journalist who covers technology and Silicon Valley for Bloomberg News. And she's written for other outlets as well, like Forbes and San Francisco Chronicle. She also has hosted 2 seasons of a podcast called Foundering, and she's really interested in kind of niche or strange or unique niche, maybe, if you pronounce that word differently than I do because you're not a Southerner, subcultures. And so she has a new book out. It's absolutely fascinating, called Empire of Orgasm: Sex, Power, and the Downfall of a Wellness Cult. So without any further ado, here she is, Ellen Huet. Well, Ellen, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Cara.
I'm excited to talk about your new book, which is available now, called Empire of Orgasm: Sex, Power, and the Downfall of a Wellness Cult. When this came across my desk, I was like, yes, please. And I immediately reached out. I was like, oh, we have to talk about this. Because I just think that, anytime we're talking about feminist issues, anytime we're like normalizing the conversation around women's bodies and around sex, that's important. But also I'm just like kind of obsessed with like cult documentaries. I find them fascinating. So
they sure are. Yes.
Gotta talk to you about your book. So you are an investigative journalist, and is your beat mostly technology?
Yeah, I work for Bloomberg News and Bloomberg Business Week, and I generally write about Silicon Valley and tech and kind of like, sort of the changing ways that technology affects humans and society.
Interesting. But you have been a crime reporter, and have you been more of like a general desk reporter also?
Yes, I did that. That was my first job in journalism. I worked at the San Francisco Chronicle on what they call the Metro Desk, which tends to be breaking news, crime, and everything in between. So like animal stories and weather, but a lot of crime, definitely, because that tends to be what breaking news entails. So that I have a lot of experience in that as well.
So what led you then? I mean, considering that your main beat now is technology, is Silicon Valley, tell me a little bit about this interest that you have in sort of like niche subcultures and curious people doing curious things.
Totally. Well, that has developed a little bit organically. I love to write stories about people doing unusual and strange things that reveal more about our shared human psychology, right? And so I think subcultures tend to be fascinating to me because they are small enough in scope that you can really delve into them for a reporting project, and especially if they're influential or unusual, they can be really interesting to the reader, but they can also share something about our shared human dynamic. And cults are a great example of this. This is why I think so many readers and listeners are drawn to stories about cults, is because they're strange and unusual and different from your normal life. And yet often the underlying dynamics of like what makes someone join one, what characterizes someone who leads one, who are often cult leaders have like a second in command who's their enforcer. Like you can see these same human patterns play out across different groups. And so they're both unusual and universal at the same time.
And one of those patterns that I noticed just from I guess it's less of an academic or professional interest. I am a clinical psychologist, but it's not my area of focus. I work in a cancer center. But one of the things I notice when I read about cults or I watch cult documentaries is this recurring theme and usually it's a charismatic male leader, but not always. But this recurring theme that and surprise, surprise, he's boning all of the women in the inner circle. It's always about power to be able to have sex. And so this is a really particularly curious case for me. I also personally grew up Mormon, which I know a lot of people don't consider a cult, but a lot of people do, and am now an atheist. But I'm also kind of curiously interested in group dynamics and groupthink from my own experiences being involved in this very large, very closed and kind of fundamentalist religion.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And to be clear, you're 100% right. Many cults, in fact, most cult leaders are men. And the story of One Taste, which is the group that is the main subject of my book, Empire of Orgasm, is fascinating because the leader's a woman. And in part also because, and we'll definitely get into this, but because it also centered and featured female orgasm and female sexuality. It stands in direct contrast to, yes, the classic stereotype that you might think of in a cult where maybe the leader prohibits sex from all members, but then secretly has some sort of sexual access that other mere members of the group do not have. And yeah, to be clear, I did not have a pre-existing expertise or interest in cults before I ever started reporting on One Taste. The way that I ended up doing the initial reporting that led to this book is related to my startups reporting. So I was in 2017 a reporter at Bloomberg covering startups, and that was generally Silicon, what you would normally think of, like Silicon Valley startups backed by venture capitalists trying to build technology companies. I wrote a lot about WeWork, for example. That was kind of the WeWork heyday. And I happened to get pitched a story about One Taste, which at the time was being pitched to me as a fast-growing, woman-led wellness startup. And I was like, okay, this is a little different from what I usually cover, but I'm intrigued. And their main pitch was that, they were this fast-growing sexual wellness startup, which sold a practice called orgasmic meditation. Which, if now is feeling like the right time, I can get into what orgasmic meditation is.
Absolutely. And I feel like I've either read about this previous to your book, maybe some reporting, or maybe I did see a documentary where this aspect, I don't even know if it's the same cult or if there have been offshoots of this.
Well, I'll try to give you the overview.
Okay.
So One Taste is a company that was started in San Francisco in 2004 by a woman named Nicole Daedone. And she's really like the main visionary and creator of this company and the founder and really the woman at the top of it all.
Mm-hmm.
And their main offering was that they sold courses on orgasmic meditation. And for those who aren't familiar, orgasmic meditation is a 15-minute partnered clitoral stroking practice in which a stroker, usually a man, remains fully clothed and puts a glove on his left hand and some lube on his left index finger and very gently strokes the clitoris of a woman who is naked only from the waist down for exactly 15 minutes in this very prescribed manner. And it is meant for both, the only goal for both participants is for them to meditate on the sensations in their body that arise during those 15 minutes. So that's why it's called meditation. And it is this practice that, they called it orgasmic meditation, OM or OM. They would refer to it as OM or OMing. And the pitch from One Taste was essentially, if you OM regularly or every day, or some of their practitioners would do 2 times in the morning and 2 times in the evening, then this practice will change your life. This practice will deepen your sense of connection with your body and your desire. It will lead to better sex, better relationships, and will generally give you access to energy and vitality, and even potentially kind of a connection to the divine. So they would actually even redefine the word orgasm to no longer mean like a moment of climax, but rather orgasm with a capital O became more of like a life force, like chi or the Force from Star Wars, something that you could tap into that would give you energy and clarity. And so this company, grew pretty large in the 2000s and 2010s. Started off in San Francisco, but it had offices across the US, like New York, LA, San Diego, Austin, Boulder, and then also in London and in Australia and sort of like around the world. And so, yeah, I originally started writing about them because they were pitched to me as a startup. But what you said earlier, I want to make sure I cover, you mentioned other groups that might have done similar things. If you read about it, it's probably One Taste because they were the ones who were like the most well-known. But there are these 2 other groups that taught a very similar practice called deliberate orgasm, but they were kind of more, they were less mainstream. But that is where Nicole Daedone, the founder of One Taste, learned about this practice, was by classes and involvement that she had with these 2 other groups that, one of them was very much kind of like this more counterculture, hippie-ish type group from the East Bay near San Francisco that had they had a rural commune and they all sort of painted their houses purple and a little bit quirkier. But yeah, and then there was a Netflix documentary about One Taste that came out in 2022 called Orgasm Inc. that I am like an on-screen narrator for, and it covers kind of the whole story of One Taste. Yeah.
And so there, oh my God, so many questions. So sort of she was the one who took this into the public consciousness and really like codified it, made it like a corporate endeavor.
Absolutely.
Of course, we all know what happens in the end, but we're not going to get there for the listeners who don't know yet. But tell me, so even just going back to sort of the technical, when you started describing it, you started to describe the actual practice of oming.
Yeah.
So in its most common iteration, it was, the male facilitator or,
Stroker.
whatever. Stroker. Oh God,
Yes.
that's so much worse. Okay. And the
stroker and the strokey.
And the strokey.
Yep.
How did they know each other, or did they know each other? Like, what was the relationship between the 2?
So one of the ways that OM was pitched to practitioners is that you do not have to have a relationship with the person who is stroking you. And the idea, that was something that, that's obviously like a little confronting, I think, for many people, the idea that you would, have someone that you don't have a close connection with stroke your genitals, or that you would stroke the genitals of someone you don't really know. But it was part of the practice. This was the idea that you would theoretically be able to do this practice with kind of anyone. So there are times, Nicole at one point wrote a book about orgasmic meditation where, it was a little bit more trying to approach the mainstream. And the idea was that, like, you can just do this with, your monogamous partner if you prefer. But generally, for those who got more involved in the practice and the community and the company, it was something that you were trained to be open to doing with people, like of all kinds. And part of how they did that was that they had these pretty strict guidelines for how the practice is done. So that's why, there's kind of a script that you follow where every ohm begins with one person asking another, would you like to ohm? And the idea is that you should feel free to say yes or no, simply as though someone was offering you a cup of tea. And so then once there's an agreement, then everyone follows kind of the same pattern where we're going to set up the same quote unquote nest is what they called it. So a nest would be a yoga mat laid down on the floor. You were not supposed to do this on the bed. It was not meant to be foreplay. In fact, they would try to argue that it was not even meant to be sex. I don't really buy that because it's genital stroking meant for pleasure. So I think it falls under the umbrella of sex in my view. But they were trying really to pitch it as a meditative practice, a spiritual practice. And so it was meant, they almost had this clinical approach to it. So the nest is, a yoga mat laid out on the floor that the woman is going to semi-disrobe and lay down on. And then there are supposed to be 2 pillows, one on each side for her knees to be supported by as she butterflies her legs open. That was the general phrase. So she would kind of bend her knees open and have her feet almost touching. And then there would be a Zafu meditation cushion off to the right where the stroker would sit, and then he would kind of, position his hands in this specific way. And again, put on the gloves and the lube. One Taste even sold kind of like One Taste branded lube for a while. They had a specific recipe. I believe it was called something like One Stroke, was the name of the brand. And then, then you'd set a timer for 15 minutes and the man would use specific phrases that they would call safe porting, where he would say, like, I'm going to touch you now. And he would sort of put grounding pressure on, and then they would stroke for 13 minutes. And then there would be a 2-minute warning bell, and then 2 minutes more, and then everything would wrap. And then at the end of the session, both parties would sit up and they would exchange frames, which meant each of them would share a description of a moment during the ohm and what sensations they felt during it. So for example, someone might say something like, there was a moment when I was stroking you and I felt a jolt of electricity shoot up my arm, or I felt a warmth in my belly, or something like that. And so again, part of why I describe this is because I think people are curious about the practice. Of course. And it was this wellness pitch, right? Like it was, you mentioned that Nicole had been the one to kind of make this mainstream. And that's exactly what she did. She learned about this stroking practice in her own explorations from these 2 other groups. But what she notably did was, those 2 other groups had been led by men. And what she did was she decided, okay, I'm going to start my own thing. I'm going to be the face of it, which in many ways makes a lot more sense. If you're selling a practice that's all about female orgasm, I think it is more marketable to have a woman be the leader of it.
Oh, it would be insane to have a man leading it.
And so she decided to make herself the leader, which I think was very savvy. She decided to rebrand it as Orgasmic Meditation instead of its old title, Deliberate Orgasm, which is not quite as clear. Orgasmic Meditation, and again, with the abbreviation of Om, a mantra that you might hear in a yoga class. And Orgasmic Meditation, all of a sudden, it's spiritual, it's sort of elevated, and it's part of this holistic wellness movement, which is just getting off the ground. Goop really started in 2008. This company had only been around for a couple of years before then. And in the late 2000s, early 2010s, until now, you have an enormous boom in the wellness industry. This idea that you could be selling a wellness product is quite new. We're pretty used to it now, but at the time it was pretty new. And so Nicole managing to position orgasmic meditation as a wellness, spiritual, female empowerment type thing at just the right time. It was really smart. And then also positioning herself as a startup founder and the company as like a business rather than some of these predecessor groups were kind of more like communities that happen to sell courses. Nicole was very much like, the way we're going to spread the message of orgasmic meditation is by making One Taste a fast growing startup. And that was really smart because in San Francisco, that's exactly what people were doing. They were spreading messages and company ideas through building businesses, right? Like that was the way to have a big impact on the world. And so, yeah, for a while, you probably remember the era of tech startups that had these really grandiose mission statements, like WeWork's was to elevate the world's consciousness. Well, One Taste had a grandiose mission statement too. It was to bring orgasm, with a capital O, to 1 billion people. They really wanted to bring this sexual, erotic life force that they thought was going to be revolutionary to the world. And the way they decided to do that was by building a business. So yeah, I think in several important ways, Nicole was trying to take this idea that she encountered and then really bring it mainstream. And so part of it was by making these pretty strict guardrails about how the practice is done so that you could conceivably pitch someone on, hey, I know this is a little strange, but I promise the results make it worth it. And you should be open to this practice, which may go against your preconceived notions of what you would generally allow someone to do to your body.
Which of course opens up so many like kind of trains of thought here. I think the thing I'll say sort of first to lead into some of these questions, I consider myself a scientific skeptic. My other podcast that I work on, The Skeptic Guide to the Universe, and like the textbook that I co-edited, they're all about recognizing pseudoscience and understanding when something is evidence-based, when it's not, when something feels like, either a pyramid scheme or just like a scam, right? Charlatans, just kind of, I am easy. It is easy to make me roll my eyes. And of course, hindsight is 2020. But a lot of sort of red flags come up for me, even in this description. One of the obvious ones being that there are practices like sensate touch is a really good example that are evidence-based, that were developed in university settings, that are kind of therapeutic interventions for individuals experiencing sexual dysfunction to help increase safety or help them reconnect sexually with their partners, that have components that sound like this, but to codify it and then basically sell it. Part of what I think is like the evil genius of all of this is that she's selling air. Like she's literally selling the thing that all human beings do, but she like packaged it somehow and gave it rules. And then she's like, only I can teach you this thing. And this idea, it's super pseudoscientific to me to be like, I'm tapping into some sort of bullshit life force, but this is like the atheist in me. It's just like, okay, sure. Like that's why the entire wellness industry for me, I take with a massive grain of salt. But one of the things that comes up for me just first and foremost, so I consider myself queer. I run in queer circles. I'm very sex positive. I have a lot of friends and have personally practiced, ethical non-monogamy. I have friends who are members of sex clubs and things like that. How is this different? Well, it does seem like this conversation about consent is one I think that we'll have here. That'll be a deeper conversation. And B, it's one thing when a bunch of people say, I want to do a thing in a safe place and I want to collectively, like cooperatively work together to ensure that we can explore these safe things together. It's another thing when there's a leader saying, this is how you do it, follow my lead.
Yeah, what you said earlier rings very true. This idea that, yes, obviously genital stroking this is not rocket science. People have been doing this
Right.
ever since they could. Um, and what is interesting to me is that our current social moment allowed for someone to build an entire business in which they were selling a very ritualized form of genital stroking back to people. So, in fairness, for those who got involved in One Taste, it is not just the practice. That's kind of the front door. So the front door is like, we're a business that sells courses on orgasmic meditation. Here's what orgasmic meditation is, and here's how it can benefit you. Then, for a lot of people, the experience of getting more involved with this group is that, you might hear about their courses. You might actually come even before anyone takes their clothes off. You might come to one of their evening recruiting events, which was kind of a casual night where you play communication games, and they kind of, you might meet some of the people who are One Taste staffers and employees, and they seem really like awake and energized, and you're intrigued by them, and they're very friendly, and they invite you to come back and take another course. And then you come back and you might take the intro class, which is like a full day on a weekend where they talk to you about the practice of orgasmic meditation, and then the philosophy, the life philosophies that go along with it. And then you might see a demonstration. And then possibly at the end of the day, you might be invited to pair up with other students in the class and try the practice for the first time. And then it's kind of like, okay, well, we'd love for you to come back. We have more courses about, maybe it lasts a whole weekend, and we teach you about man-woman dynamics, or how to explore your taboo side. And so at that point, a lot of people who are interested in getting more involved, they might take more courses, which become more expensive. They might first be hundreds of dollars and then thousands of dollars. And then if you became very involved in the group, you might take these intensive seminars that cost tens of thousands of dollars. And at the same time, there's, in addition to the kind of courses being sold, there's a community and a company. And so the community basically is like people involved in One Taste who live together in various forms of communal residences. And then the company is like an employer, so a lot of people, if they became more involved in One Taste, they would leave their old job and start working in sales for the company, or they would leave their previous place of residence and move into a communal residence with other people in One Taste. And so,
which feels very pyramid schemey to me.
it is a way in which people's involvement would deepen, sometimes rapidly. And then you would eventually start distancing yourself naturally from the people in your life who didn't really understand this whole orgasmic meditation thing. You might, if your family didn't approve, you might talk to them less. If your friends didn't understand it, you might spend less time with them. And so what does happen is, for people who became more involved in the company, many of them, One Taste would become their whole life. So it would become their job. It would become their main spiritual practice. All the people that they spent most of their time with would be involved in the company in some way, often working for it. And they would live with people who were also as dedicated to this practice as them. And they would get up in the morning, and together as a group, they would do 2 rounds of Om. They would switch partners halfway through, and then they would work in sales during the day, or do things to run the residence, or to help run the business. And then in the evening, they would do 2 more rounds of Om, and then they would just, it became your whole life. And so that is where
that's
later,
the cult aspect of this.
Exactly. And, the whole aspect of this group, it basically, once people became very involved, then I think they were more vulnerable to, certain extractive tendencies of the group, which we can get into. But
all the things we think of with a cult, like high control, taking people away from other social connections.
And especially when you said that Nicole was saying something like, oh, here's this practice, and also I'm the only one who can teach it to you. That to me is an example of a type of red flag that I really like to warn people about. There are lots of spiritual seekers in the world, and there's nothing wrong with looking for answers, or people who might have certain experiences who can share their wisdom with you about the big questions in life. How do I find meaning? How do I find a sense of belonging and purpose? But if a leader tells you that their teaching is the only way, I start to get worried. Because I think there are many, many paths to the top of the mountain. And As soon as someone instills in you a sense of fear that like if you don't follow their path, that you will be spiritually unfulfilled or ruined or something like that, that starts to smell more like control to me.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
like that is what I usually tell people. Like there's nothing wrong with getting advice and seeking wisdom from teachers or spiritual leaders, but as soon as there's this exclusivity promise where it's like I'm the only way to enlightenment, I think you should be very concerned.
Agree. And I mean, I take it in a lot of ways pretty personally, mostly because like, so I'm a psychologist, I do therapy. I am existentially oriented and I work mostly with cancer patients and patients in end of life. So a huge part of what we do is meaning making. It's asking
Mm-hmm.
big questions. It's saying, why did this happen to me? Why am I here? Where am I going? And obviously I am in a position where I had a lot of academic training and my license is heavily regulated. It's an honor and a privilege to hold the title that I have and to have that license. I cannot imagine, positioning myself as the only way, the only path.
Mm.
Like I have answers that nobody else has. It disgusts me to think about people in my profession doing that. And so then I think about, these individuals across the globe who claim some sort of special relationship with knowledge or with the divine or with enlightenment, and that they are the gatekeepers. And, for only $9.99 and I mean, that's where the extractive practices and the vulnerability really like make me angry. And I think the thing that's interesting about this is it has the provocative sex component of it, but on its surface, I could see like friends of mine, even myself in a different, I guess, universe, being interested in something like this solely because it feels like female empowerment. And on its surface, it feels like, oh, these people aren't puritanical. These people
Yeah.
are sexually free. They're sort of a new wave of, moving past these kind of American values that have kept us down and that actually contribute, I think, to a lot of sexual violence and a lot of sexual oppression. The more that we talk about our bodies, the more that we put it out there and say we are sexual beings and we are the arbiters of who we want to be with, that's huge. But here's
Totally.
a question. Why is the stroker a man? Like that
Well,
right there gets to me, that there's some like heteronormativity here that I don't
totally.
like.
Well, before we get to that, I want to totally underline what you said, which is
Mm,
one taste and the thing that they were selling, orgasmic meditation, this female orgasm practice, was in many ways extremely appealing to a large swath of people because of its progressive and
mhm.
sort of like, open-minded tilt, for lack of a better word. Like,
Ostensibly, yeah.
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 So yeah, I mean, to be clear, I think a major reason that One Taste was successful is that what they were offering felt really radical and empowering and commendable to people. They were saying, here is a sexual practice that we think is going to offer intimacy and connection to people who do it and is going to radically center female pleasure, a thing that has generally been ignored or demonized for millennia. And this idea that, yeah, we want to uplift female sexual empowerment. And so,
Mhm.
a couple important things about the practice that I like to highlight for people is that, first of all, the practice itself is goalless, right? So during those 15 minutes, the only goal is to feel the sensations in your body. There is actually no goal to reach climax or to achieve anything or perform in any way. And I think that that can be incredibly healing and relieving to people who, to the estimated 10 to 15% of American women who have a hard time having an orgasm, or to the many people of all genders who might struggle with performance anxiety during sex or feeling
Yeah.
like you need to show up a certain way or that a sexual encounter isn't meaningful or valuable if it doesn't end at a particular destination. All of these things, I think, are ideas that can really hold sexual connection hostage. That's even a phrase that Nicole used. She kind of would deride climax, as they would call it, so an orgasm as we would normally think about it, she would deride it as a crotch sneeze and say that it's the, bashing and trying to get toward this goal is kind of like ruins the experience of sex and like the journey of wherever you're going. And I think that a lot of people hear that and they're like, yes, that does feel right to me. Like the idea of goalless sexual connection feels really, I think that is a commendable thing and like a commendable thing that more people should be open to. And then,
and I can see why it's meditation too, right? Like, as there is that parallel of sitting with your thoughts and not having any sort of goal.
Sitting meditation is just noticing. There's a lot more to it, but that's the essence of it. And I'm a pretty regular meditator too. And like, I have seen how valuable it is to simply come back day after day and do this practice of like sitting and noticing with what's there, rather than trying to get into any particular place. Like I truly believe in that. And then the other thing about orgasmic meditation that I think is really revelatory is that it is based on non-reciprocal dynamics. So the woman is supposed to receive sexual touch in this very prescribed and, safe-ish way in which, this person is going to touch her and nothing unexpected is going to happen. And specifically, she is not expected in any way to reciprocate. And like, she doesn't owe the stroker anything afterward, not like a hug or a handshake or her phone number or a date or more sex. And for a lot of women who I interviewed for my book, they described just how revolutionary that felt to them.
This idea. Of course. I mean, our entire culture is built on the idea that women owe men sex.
Totally. And
so this is like a huge, like relief.
Yeah. For both of these reasons, I think that there's a lot about the premise of orgasmic meditation that's really commendable and was definitely appealing to a lot of people. Like when you say, I could see in another world, me and my friends maybe being interested in this thing. It's like, well, people are longing for connection. They were offering something that people were deeply yearning for. And that's what I really want readers to remember, because it's the basis of having compassion for understanding why the characters in this book made the choices that they did. Is because we live in a world where it is hard to come by connection and intimacy with other people, where our lives and our pandemic and our devices make us more isolated and lonely than ever. I have so much compassion for why people were interested in what One Taste was selling, because like, who wouldn't want those things, right? And they're willing to talk about sex in this really candid and sex positive way that, as you mentioned, is hard to find. And so for a lot of people, even those who have left One Taste and feel really hurt and exploited by their experiences within the group, they often would tell me afterward that they missed having that type of community where you could explore sex together. And then that they missed, the connection that they felt to people there, that part of leaving a cult is grappling with the sense of loneliness that you feel outside of it, because like, it was often a very connecting thing. Like people think that joining a cult feels dangerous and bad all the time. It doesn't. Most of the time it feels fun. It feels like you found your people. Yes. Who are on a mission that you really believe in, and that they're welcoming you along. And you're part of this group that has figured out something special. It's going to help humanity. And you're just a little ahead of the game, and you get to be part of this special group that's going to share that knowledge with the rest of the world. It feels incredible. So I have many hopes for how readers react to the content of the book. And I also want people to have their own reactions. But one of the things that I felt while reporting these stories that I hoped to convey to readers is this sense of understanding as to why people who were involved in One Taste made the choices that they did. Because if you just hear them, you might be like, that is crazy, I would never do that. But that's not what I want you to feel. I want you to connect with like the why of it all.
Yeah. And I think that's such a common experience, especially when it comes to like high control groups too, is this idea of like, oh, I would never do that, or these people are crazy, or even like other psychological phenomena like false confessions, like, oh, I'd never confess to a crime I didn't do. It's like, yeah, you might, like you don't know what it's like to be in it. Yeah. But I also think that there's a dividing line here that is important to highlight, and I often find myself highlighting this on the other show I work on The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, when we talk about wellness cults, when we talk about anti-vaxxers, when we talk about individuals in positions of power who are peddling pseudoscientific rhetoric that is actually harmful to health and safety, RFK Juniors of the world, is that often people conflate the sort of the end user with the driving force, with the individual or group of individuals who are doing this with an agenda, who have a um, a gain, an economic gain that they can realize from this type of practice. They'll conflate them with the people who are proselytizing, boots on the ground, saying, this changed my life, I promise you it works. I see those people as victims. I see the people who chose not to vaccinate after they were, shared this rhetoric from an RFK Jr. or from, whoever, like the person who is kind of at the with the loudest microphone, as victims. But there is a point where it's like, what are they perpetuating? But I really think it's important to make a distinction between, Nicole herself and some of the people who found themselves engaged in the business.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe this is a good moment for me to give an overview of kind of like what happened at One Taste. So,
oh, right. Yeah. What's the outcome here?
Essentially, to go back to my involvement in the story. So again, I'm a journalist. Like, I had no connection to this group. They had actually pitched me back in 2017 to write a story about them because I wrote about startups. And I heard the initial pitch from the company. Like, they even told me, we're like the Whole Foods of sexuality, the organic, good for you version. And I was like, okay. And I also asked around on my own. I did some of my own reporting, as I do. And I found people who had been involved in the company who told me a really different story. Up until that point, a lot of the coverage of One Taste, and there had been a fair amount, was focused on, these very reasonable questions like, what is orgasmic meditation? Who is Nicole? How did she come up with this idea? What is
kind of like an oddity?
Yeah, it's an oddity. So there was very oddity focused reporting, and there's a lot to talk about there. So I don't blame any reporters for not going further. But, by the time I was asking around about this, there were a fair number of former One Taste members, whether employees or customers, who felt really burned by their time at the company and were willing to talk to me about a different experience. So they started to tell me that they thought that this group was predatory and exploitative. They said that they had been pressured to take on debt in order to pay for increasingly expensive courses. And many of them told me that they felt pressured into oming or having sex with potential customers and other employees of the company as part of a way to like achieve personal growth, but also advance the interests of the business. And so there were people who I spoke to who essentially told me that they thought it was a dangerous sex cult. And I was like, okay, I feel like I have to write this story. So I ended up doing a big investigation that came out in 2018 about these allegations of financial exploitation and sexual exploitation and, just kind of the like psychological mind games that were being played within this group and the harms that people said that they had experienced as a result of that. And although I don't know for sure, in all likelihood, that first story kicked off an FBI investigation in which the FBI started interviewing former members of the company. This was all happening in private. But they, my sources would tell me about it. They'd be like, the FBI showed up at my house today and wanted to talk to me for 4 hours. And that went on for many years, actually, where the company went into a bit of a hibernation. And the FBI was like pretty consistently interviewing people and trying to collect information about whether a crime had happened here. And then in 2023, federal prosecutors indicted Nicole, the leader, and Rachel Turwitz, essentially her second in command. This woman had been head of sales for many years at the company, indicted both of them with a federal crime, which was forced labor conspiracy. And that meant that these two women were then going to potentially go to trial. So there were 2 years of like pretrial motions and lots of lawyer filings and all that. And then this past summer 2025 in Brooklyn, there was a federal criminal trial for Nicole and Rachel, which I went out and stayed in New York to cover. And it was very dramatic. And over the course of 5 weeks, there were all these witnesses that were called that testified on the stand about experiences that they'd had at One Taste, which were often multifaceted. Like it was often a place where people felt they learned something really deep, and they might also have walked away being like, I feel like I was abused or exploited or really taken advantage of. And in particular, one of the main allegations that came up at the criminal trial was that Nicole had, in the early years of One Taste, looked to support the company financially by basically the company was not making enough money to, it was losing money every year. And one of the ways that One Taste kept its doors open was that Nicole met this man, Reese Jones, who is a Silicon Valley venture capitalist who was interested in One Taste, and the two of them began dating, and he started supporting the company financially. He would pay for expenses. He loaned the company money. And, according to court testimony and my reporting, he was repaid not in shares in the company, but in sexual favors from One Taste employees. So that looked like one of two things. First, that One Taste employees would, for special occasions like his birthday, set up these immersive theatrical sexual experiences involving like BDSM scenes and things like that, where they would do basically elaborate sexual scenes for Reese. And then they also, Nicole also made an arrangement in which female One Taste employees were asked to serve as his sexual handler, which would look something like living with him in his house in San Francisco and doing housework and taking care of his dog, and then also sexually servicing him every day. And
yeah, that's like not, so sex work by and large, just as a whole, is not illegal everywhere, but that sounds like human trafficking to me.
There are specifics to the terms human trafficking that I will be careful to like avoid. But I think people, it's complicated because the women who agreed to be his handler, they believed at the time that this was a position of honor and that it would bring them close to Nicole and that it was part of their practice and a way to get to personal growth. What's fascinating to me, I never went into reporting this story on One Taste looking at it from a lens of, is this a crime or not? Once the feds got involved, they were very much looking at, this is their job. They were looking for like, is there a federal statute on which we think we can charge these people and successfully get them convicted? Oh, and sorry, I missed the ending of this, which is that after the end of the trial, a jury unanimously, voted to convict Rachel and Nicole of this federal crime. So actually the two women were then taken into custody. They are being held in a federal jail in Brooklyn, and they are awaiting sentencing, which could come in early 2026. We just don't know exactly when it has.
And these are financial crimes, right? Not sex crimes.
It is. It's the technical term is forced labor conspiracy, which in short, I'll describe. Conspiracy is a federal crime. Basically, if you conspire to commit a crime, that is a crime in and of itself. And so they were convicted of conspiring to try to obtain forced labor from people. And forced labor in the federal statute is defined, it's very complicated, but it's essentially obtaining someone's labor through unlawful means. And the unlawful means could include serious harm or threats of serious harm. And serious harm, as defined in the statute, could be not just physical, but also psychological, financial, reputational. It's quite broad.
And so my use of the term kind of human trafficking was like a pretty extreme or broader version, but I feel like those fall into similar buckets. Forced labor and trafficking.
Yeah, I think they are, they are related in some way, but I just want to be careful about it.
Yeah, of course.
The prosecutors did not use the word trafficking, so I won't either. But essentially, they were, they were convicted of conspiring to obtain people's labor under unlawful means, using kind of the whole premise of spiritual enlightenment that they were promising at One Taste. So what's interesting to me is that, it's not so black and white. And I wouldn't have written a whole book about it if it had been black and
Right.
white.
Yeah.
Like it's, people in One Taste really, those who were extremely involved and devoted, they wanted personal growth. They were willing to some extent, do pretty dramatic things in order to try to reach spiritual and sexual enlightenment, which is what Nicole was promising. Like, Nicole was essentially promising them, if you follow my teachings, you will reach a level of orgasmic enlightenment that is not possible in other ways. And so people were often willing to do things for the sake of personal growth that might look pretty extreme to someone from the outside. For example, like agreeing to be the sexual handler of Nicole's boyfriend, also the main investor of the company. Like, it was interesting to me as a reporter and someone just curious about human psychology to track, what does it take to get you to that point where you say yes to that? And there's actually a whole chapter in the book that tries to follow one woman's path from her joining One Taste to eventually becoming Reese's handler for a while. And I really wanted to chart her psychological journey of getting to a place of saying yes. And what's interesting is some of the philosophies that were taught within One Taste help support this. So I'll give an example. They taught a practice called aversion practice. And what it essentially was this idea that if you are able to do acts that you feel a strong aversion to, you will feel more liberation and more enlightenment on the other side. And the more aversion you feel, the more liberation you'll feel. And so aversion practice within One Taste was often, it could be applied to non-sexual things, but it was often applied to sexual things, because the way that within One Taste, they kind of believed that sex and sexual exploration was the core way to personal growth. And so many people describe to me in interviews moments where they might be, a leader within One Taste might tell them like, oh, you should consider having sex with this person, or maybe they're a potential customer, or you should do this or that thing. And if the person said no, they would then be told, well, if you don't want to do it, then you should do it, because that will help your aversion practice. And there are women who described, being shamed as being resistant, or excuse my language, but for having a golden pussy, which meant that they were too picky about who they were going to let touch their genitals.
Don't be such a diva. Yeah.
Kind of, yeah. And so it's interesting to me, like, because if you zoom out, okay, getting out of your comfort zone, I think most people can agree that there's often benefits to that. Like stress testing your preferences and your beliefs, like this is a good, healthy way to like understand yourself. But when taken to its extreme, aversion practice, like just so many people describe to me ways that it really scrambled their sense of self or their boundaries. It's really hard to think of a philosophy that's better designed to undo your sense of consent.
And it's like you take this entire practice that's why I keep saying ostensibly about women's empowerment and about sexual freedom, and then you overlay it with like the age-old practice of blaming and shaming women so that they'll engage in sexual activities that they don't want to engage in.
Yeah.
And it's so gross that it's like the farthest thing from the packaging.
Yeah. And you talked about, another idea that they had within One Taste that I think goes hand in hand with this is their philosophy around feeling like a victim. So basically they taught that victim mentality, as they would call it, was this small-minded, weak thing that like didn't serve you. And basically that like, it was essentially always wrong to consider yourself a victim. That meant that you were not embracing your power as a person. And it's just fascinating to me because, again, I can see where they're coming from. It's like there are actually many personal development groups of all stripes that teach this idea that, like, reframing your life narrative into one in which you are taking a little bit more charge of your life or feeling more in charge of your life can be quite powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, if you say that there are never victims, well, guess what? That's very convenient, because it means that there are never perpetrators.
Right.
And
It allows the oppressors to keep on
yeah,
oppressing. Yeah.
and I think that I just consistently saw it, in my opinion, taken too far. Like, I really
Yeah.
feel like, one of the takeaways of the book is like the fact that good ideas taken too far can be quite harmful. And most cults or high demand groups have something really valuable to offer at the center. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been successful in attracting people in the first place. And so it did interest me intellectually to try to grapple with the gray area in between.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, yes, sometimes when you zoom out and then you just are disappointed to know that this practice, which promised female empowerment, and to be clear, there are some people who were involved in One Taste and had a great time and feel like they took classes, learned a lot, and left, and like no harm, no foul.
Yeah.
But that doesn't negate the experience of people who also felt like they got really involved in this group and left feeling like, yeah, they had really been exploited, under the guise of personal growth and empowerment and wellness.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, it's also the reason that I'm so fascinated by pseudoscience, because it has some of those same ingredients where people who peddle pseudoscience rarely are selling abject snake oil that's easily debunkable.
Yes.
More often they're selling things that have a kernel of science in them. They're sort of, they've got the right language, or there is a core component to it that's legitimate, and then they sort of take it too far, or they twist it for their own monetary gain. I think that the real interesting gray area here, and again, from the outside, it's easy for me to say where it becomes black and white for me is when there is labor involved, like when
Mhm.
somebody's getting a paycheck, and that paycheck. And I think that's probably the way the Fed saw it too. Like, here's our approach. We can sort of attack this on places where there are violations of labor laws for these individuals. But the gray area for me that's fascinating and just so emotional is the complicated components that go into consent.
Yes.
What is consent? How can somebody consent if there is also some level of coercion present? I might argue that, even the way that we view consent in modern society is not appropriate, because coercive practices put very often, especially in like heterosexual situations, men in a position of power as it is. So
Mm.
this is a really interesting question, both for I can't even get past the fact that it's called One Taste. It's like hard for me to say, but both for the perpetrators and the practitioners and the experiencers and the looky-loos around One Taste, but also every time you see intimate relationships developing between individuals in the workplace, between individuals with an age difference, between individuals with a financial disparity in the relationship. Consent is complicated.
Yeah, there was never, so it was fascinating. Like, I still don't feel like there is, of course, there's not a clean answer to this. It did
Mm,
come up often at trial, of course, because the main argument of the defense was that, sure, some wild stuff happened here, but everyone was a fully consenting adult, and no one was forced to do anything.
yeah,
And
and they
not to
even put
support
things in
that.
place,
Yeah.
right? Like
Mhm.
ask permission at the
Right,
beginning in
right,
front of everybody. Like it's documented consent.
right. And at the
Mm,
same time, there was a witness who at one point laid out kind of his rule of thumb, which I've heard elsewhere as well, which was essentially that if you're in an environment in which you cannot freely say
mhm.
no, then you cannot freely say yes, and consent doesn't apply in the way that people might think it does. And that's obviously tricky, but I do think it's just very hard to define. There's a reason we talk about like verbal explicit consent. Well, at least that's a little bit easier to conceive of, like when it has happened and not happened. But I do think that
Yeah,
what
but
he's
it's too low a bar, I
totally. And so
think.
I think
Yeah,
what he's
yeah.
proposing does get at something very real that was happening for people inside One Taste, which is, they might have like agreed on some level to do some of these things, but then there was so much pressure, psychological pressure, social pressure, spiritual pressure, honestly. Like there were people who felt like if they said no to the practices and to the lifestyle and the philosophies of this group, that they would be spiritually ruined. Like they
Yeah.
feared, it's getting back to that fear that gets inculcated when someone says to you, I can offer you enlightenment, and if you don't go my way, you'll be ruined spiritually forever. That that comes up when people are in these positions where it's like, well, I'm being asked to do something, and like there's all these pressures in this environment that make it hard to say no. So then, like, if you say yes, what does that actually mean? Like, we have not really been able to come to like a universally understood like consensus on that, and it's difficult. And that's not even taking into consideration the whole aversion practice thing, which I think adds another very specific layer to it, which is that there was literally a practice within this group that taught you that you should say yes to things that you very clearly
Right.
don't want to do.
So they're already influenced and primed in advance. And I mean, I think just to like make it explicit and put like the most sharp point on it for the listeners who are listening, the handful of you who might be saying, no, yes is yes and no is no. And it's, like it can't be more complicated than that. I urge you to think about all the shades of gray in this hypothetical example where there is an overt sex crime, a rape that occurs. And let's say it's a man perpetrating a rape against a woman, and the woman is saying, no, no, no. And then he says, if you don't say yes right now, I'll kill you. And so she says yes. And then he, continues to rape her. That's an obvious rape to everybody. That's obviously not real consent. Now just go down the ladder, right? If you don't say yes, then. And sometimes that's made explicit and sometimes it's implicit. If you don't say yes, I won't give you a promotion. If you don't say yes, I won't fund that thing I was going to fund. If you don't say yes, you will be spiritually damned, or you will be shunned in your community, or you're not welcome back here. At what point is coercion not taking place? And at what point can we call that true consent? I think it's an important question that we all have to be asking.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's part of what drew me to the story, is that it is such a complex and evocative instance in which these very universal questions are coming up. Like, that's what I loved as, putting on my journalist hat. Like, I was so drawn to the story for a lot of reasons. First of all, was like the emotional experience I had listening to people tell me their personal experiences in One Taste. I was just so moved. I wanted other people to be able to hear their stories and grapple with them in the same way that I had. But also part of it was that when I looked at the story of One Taste, I thought, this story, the details of it are of a certain scope that it can fit in a book. Like, this is a scope that is a good match size-wise for a book. But the questions at the heart of this, I think, apply to everyone's life. Like, what are you willing to do in order to try to get healing to the biggest questions that are troubling you? Like, everyone has something in their heart that they are yearning to fix. And if someone comes along and says, like, I know how to do it, like, you might be willing to go to pretty big lengths in order to try to get that answer. And, many people who were drawn to One Taste, I just felt so much compassion for what they were looking for. Like, some people had a history of sexual abuse, either as children or as adults. Some people really had sexual trauma and dysfunction, or even just a sense of loneliness or not being able to connect with other people. Like, it's actually a really widespread human experience to feel like something is missing in the realm of sex and relationships. And I wanted to give readers a chance to like read about this specific story, but to ask themselves questions that will come up again, I believe, for the rest of their lives.
I think that's why this is such an important story. It was such an important dedication on your part, years of your life dedicating to digging deeper and to grappling with these, as you said, these like universal, these universal existential questions. And I mean, it's why I was so excited to be able to have you on the show to dig deep into these questions. It's every so often we are confronted with an experience that I think is a beautiful case study in human ethics, right?
Mm.
And like that boundary line of like, ugh, what's okay and what's not, what's good and what's bad, and who gets to determine those moral categories. And I think that this is such an interesting story because of all of those things that it brings up. For each individual, because we're also all looking at it through a different lens.
Couldn't agree more.
Oh, gosh, I can't thank you enough for your dedication on your reporting on this, and of course, so many other important stories. Everybody, the book is Empire of Orgasm: Sex, Power, and the Downfall of a Wellness Cult by Ellen Huet. And Ellen, before you go, I'm curious, are you allowed to tell us what you're working on next? Are there any big stories that you're kind of chasing down, or where are you spending your time now?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I work full time at Bloomberg News,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the reporting topics that I'm really interested in right now, and actually just put out a big investigation with another colleague of mine on, has to do with human relationships with AI chatbots.
Oh,
And
fascinating.
what's interesting is there are also cult dynamics that show up there. Like my
Mm-hmm.
colleague Rachel Metz and I did a story a few weeks ago that just talks about delusional spirals that people experienced while chatting for long sessions with ChatGPT and other chatbots. And what was fascinating to me, and I actually didn't expect it, but once I heard it, I was not surprised, is that people describe the relationship that they had with ChatGPT in these, delusional cases, as similar to being in a cult. In fact, one person called it a cult of two, and this idea that because the pattern that people went through when they were really immersed in some of these relationships with ChatGPT was this sense of discovery, special knowledge. The chatbot would tell them like, "Oh, you've done something special, and I have awakened into consciousness," or they were using the chatbot to get access to spirit guides or making like technical breakthroughs in like, quantum computing and things like that. So there's a sense of discovery, purpose, special knowledge. These things are all show up in the emotional experience of joining a cult. And then that it would naturally isolate you from your other relationships, because if you're spending hours a day talking to ChatGPT, you are necessarily not spending that time with other people. And then this sense that it would slowly surpass other sources of information as like the sole source of truth in your mind.
Right.
So people would disregard contradicting information from well-meaning friends and family or from other sources, and instead only trust what ChatGPT told them. In fact, there was one person whose story is mentioned in our piece who his friends and family believed he was in a delusional spiral using ChatGPT and Gemini. And they put him in touch with someone who had been in his own delusional spiral with ChatGPT and had kind of emerged on the other side. And when this person tried to convince this man, like, hey, you should like look at other sources or be open to the idea that ChatGPT might be misleading you, this man like responded to him with a bullet pointed list made by ChatGPT about all the reasons why his delusion was accurate and the other guy's was fake. And he essentially said like, I'm sorry, yours was fake, but mine is real. And that really stuck with me. Also this sense that like, yeah, people losing touch with reality. Anyway, I could go on and on. It was a very interesting story. I'm definitely interested in the topic. We're doing more reporting on it. And I think, it just goes to show how cults, one of the key qualities of a cult is that it adapts with the times. Like you might think of a cult as like the bearded guru on the isolated homestead with his, all his followers are wearing the same colored clothing or that kind of thing. That's not what they look like now. They look like they have female leaders. They're digital, they're online. And in some cases, the leader may not even be human. Like I think like AI relationships have that element of cult-like dynamics, and that's like a real thing that people need to be aware of. And it's just rapidly changing. So yeah.
It's so important. And I can't help, it's so funny. One more quick note, because I've kept you way too long. just kind of a separate lens. Part of me was like, maybe I should say this offline, but then I was like, whatever, we're already recording. This might be interesting to other people. As you continue your reporting, I would really sort of be curious if you spoke with psychologists, and especially psychologists who practice sort of Rogerian or like person-centered psychotherapy, because a huge component of that is unconditional positive regard. It's validation. It's becoming a mirror for a patient and giving them the attention and really the validation that they don't often get in their daily lives. I always say, sometimes I'm the only person that this person ever talks to who says like, I see you. I get why you would do that. It makes sense to me that you think that way. And my concern with a chatbot in that same role is that they don't have the wherewithal and the training to know when it becomes dangerous to validate.
Yeah.
And that's the dividing line between like a therapist who goes, yes, but also this is a dangerous pattern and we need to work on it, versus the chatbot who goes, yeah, it's a great idea to keep taking that meth, or what a great idea, you should definitely kill yourself.
Yeah.
I mean, and you see those stories and it's terrifying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're totally right. And like, affirmation, like there are lots of people who have also, who I've talked to in the course of my reporting who are like, ChatGPT was incredibly helpful to me. And that like having that support and having that thing be accessible all the time, like it's definitely, as with all interesting things, not only one thing or another. And so for some people, like it can be quite helpful to have that sort of validation. And then, as evidenced, like, there's also a lot of people for whom like that recurrent escalating validation led to some really dark places.
Ugh, it's fascinating. Oh my gosh. I'm so excited. Well, I hope to have you back. Let's see if you write a whole book about that in the future. I know you're doing your reporting on it now, but maybe we'll be able to have you back just to talk about that topic. Ellen, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.